Hello, so this is my project on Rabbit Hole, and I chose The Cosmere, which is a mega series of books by Brandon Sanderson. It measures about 30 something, not counting scrapped books and previous versions like The Way of King's Prime or Mythwalker. So, a lot of things in this will be oversimplified because I don't have the hour and a half to explain everything. So without further ado, let's get started. So, in Elantris, the first book ever published by him, it's not a short story, we meet Raoden, a prince who gets turned into Elantrian, which is a fallen down god that is now stuck in their transformation into gods that can access the door, which is actually the remains of the Shards of Devotion and Dominion. Shards are these super powerful creatures in the universe. There are 16 of them, or 15, or 17. It's complicated. And they can influence pretty much anything. I'll get to that a lot more in the Mistborn section. We also meet Sarene, but she literally doesn't matter in the plot at all until very late on, and that's just to be a MacGuffin to get Raoden out. And let's just have a few chapters where we get to see things that happen to Raoden. Now trapped in Elantris, a once bright and happy city of the gods that is now decrepit. And we get backstory on an evil monk. 300 pages later, Raoden escapes, says hi to Sarene, and goes back to Elantris. At this point, the king commits suicide for other reasons, and Hrathen, the evil monk, takes a potion to make him look temporarily like an Elantrian. He turns back to normal and gives Sarene the potion, turning into her Elantrian temporarily. Eventually, we have all the evil monks show up and attempt to kill all the Elantrians, and Hrathen becomes a not as evil monk in a redemption arc that takes roughly 10 pages. And eventually, the world is saved. Raoden turns all the Elantrians back to normal things, to fixing the Aeon that Elantris and its tiny cities around it were made of by drawing the extra lines for the chasm, an event that created a chasm. So, the world is saved and the Elantrians go back to normal. Secondly, The Hope of Elantris is a short story that tells the story from Sarene Sion perspective, how some Elantrian children escaped during the climax of Elantris. Then we have The Emperor's Soul, which generated one of my favorite quotes in the series. We tame the elements, bend nature to our will. It makes us feel as if we're in control, except in doing so, we merely place one influence with another. So, we meet a person that can forge soul, and this basically means that she can change an object's history if she knows that object's history. And she gets voluntold after being caught to forge the Emperor, who is now brain dead after an attack, a new soul. She gets locked up for 100 days, creates the Emperor a new soul, and the faction that is currently ruling the Empire is saved. She then escapes and the story ends. Now, getting on to the Mistborn section, this contains one of the more famous opening lines from the Meg series. In the final Empire, ash fell from the sky. So, on the first page, the entire first trilogy is spoiled if you know where to look, but that doesn't really matter because unless you're actively looking for it, you won't actually find it. We also meet Kelsier and Menace in the prologue. They're the only ones in the prologue that are ever mentioned again. We also see the Ska, or serfs, called Kelsier, the Lord of Scars, and the survivor of Huthson, if I remember correctly. In the first chapter, we meet Vin, who uses luck, actually an emotional element, see this world's magic system, to escape situations that would be otherwise dangerous to her and her thieving crew. At this point, they go and attract one of the most dangerous things in the world at that time to them, and Kelsier bursts in with his friend Doxon after distracting him. Skipping ahead a bit, Vin meets Kelsier's group, who are either half noble and therefore able to at least potentially have allomancy, or a full-blooded noble. They accept a mission to take down the final empire, which is the thing that's oppressing all the Ska. And it governs the entire northern world, but the southern world is not very explored at this point, and it's only ever mentioned to exist starting in Shadows of Self, the 5th book in the series, and part of the second, I think it's tetralogy at this point. It's meant to be a trilogy. So, it's they accept it for $30,000, essentially, half up front and half later, to amass an army of, I think it was 10,000 Ska. So, eventually, we go to Craddock Shaw, the Lord Ruler's palace. They proceed to almost die at both Calcier and Ven proceed to almost die at the hands of a trio of Steel Inquisitors, the monstrosities created by hammering spikes through Allomancers into another human. Sazed saves them, but Ven is unconscious for weeks. She wakes up after being watched over by Spook, an urchin who doesn't matter until Book 3. We then learn that some executions are about to happen, and the gang goes there to stop them. And by that, I mean that Calcier kills a Steel Inquisitor, though notably it is mentioned that he isn't the first one, while the others hang back. Calcier then martyrs himself with one of the other more famous lines, which is, "You cannot kill me, Lord Ruler, for I'm the one thing you cannot kill. I am hope." And the Ska go into revolt, and the world is saved without too many main characters dying. This does not hold up for the second and third books. Lastly, the entire time there's been a romance subplot for Vin with the hero of House Venture, Elend. He likes books, and that's pretty much his entire character for the book. Now, The Well of Ascension, the second book in the series, is pretty okay. So, we come back to Scadrial about a year later. Elend the king now gets deposed because Vin is the person that defeated the Lord Ruler, so they all think that she's super cool or something. So Calcier becomes a religious figure, essentially, and the gang goes and mind controls some hemalurgic creations. Hemalurgic creations are like what Steel Inquisitors are. You hammer spikes into a thing, or put spikes into a thing. We also learn about Sazed's powers, called Ferukami. He stores an attribute in pieces of metal called metal mines. For example, he can fill a weight metal mine, making himself lighter, then tap it, making him twice as heavy for an hour, or 4 times as heavy for 30 minutes, or so on. And that's pretty much the entire book. It really sets up a lot of things for Book 3, which is by far the most interesting book in the series. First trilogy. Which sounds weird, but what can you do? It's just Brandon Sanderson, Shannara. So, another year later, we meet back up with the main character. Spook, the Tin Eye from the first book, also becomes the main character. He has most of the truly important scenes. Vin and Elend are going around mind controlling things because why not? And we learn that their ability to mind control hemalurgic creations comes from the Shard Ruin, who controls the Steel Inquisitors whilst looking for his god metal, Aedion, which is, coincidentally, mostly destroyed by Calcier in the first book. We also learn that Vin is apparently the hero of ages, the person meant to defeat Ruin by wielding the remains of the Shard Preservation, which was completely killed a while ago, but was basically hanging on by a thread since before the Requiem's Cosmere event, thousands of years in the past. In the end, all but 5 or so main characters, or characters of Calcier's gang, are dead because Mistborn. And Vin dies, basically saving Elend and some other characters, including Captain Demo, a Ska slave that is pretty much the most productive person in this book that doesn't get a viewpoint. So, Sazed then takes up the power of preservation and Ruin because Vin and Ruin's vessel, Adi, killed each other, and Sazed just so happened to be in front of them at the time and used his speed metal mind to dash right to the sources of extreme godly power. So he wields both of them and becomes the Shard of, I believe it was called Harmony, that represents the balance between preservation and ruin. He then uses copper mines, which are things that can store memories perfectly, except when ruin tampers with them. But considering that he is ruin now, sort of tampered with, to make the planet like it was before the Lord Ruler. So, the first book in Era 2 of Mistborn is The Alloy of Law, which has one of my favorite quotes. The ways of Wayne are mysterious and incomprehensible. So, we return to the Mistborn world about 350 years later and meet a whole new cast of characters, except a few Kandra, which are a race that at this point in the Cosmere can effectively be immortal because they so far have not died of natural causes as far as we know. So we meet Wayne Wax, a character that gets killed off in the prologue, and the Harms family, which are descended from Spook, the Lord Mistborn, the last known Mistborn, besides Marsh, if you count him as a Steel Inquisitor, as he's not truly a Mistborn, he just has the powers from Hemorrhagy. Also, he's now a religious figure taking up the family role of heading a religion. It is known as Sliverism and is supposedly, as far as we know, the evolution of the religion that was in place during the Lord Ruler's reign. He's the only person that has adium because Kelsier destroyed the pits of Hathsin, and the rest was used in the final battle against Ruin and the Hero of Ages. He uses compounding, where he ages up by tapping age into an adium metal mine, then burning it via compounding. And that makes the age that he became older with become infinitely better when it becomes new. For example, if he stores up a year older, he can then become 2 years younger or something like that. This gets explored more fully with the villain of this book, Miles Hundred Lives. Miles Hundred Lives is a former constable who, after seeing so many times the people that he's trying to protect fell to the dark side, he was the chosen one, and started robbing people, and also taking bullet shots to the head. But he can heal via compounding, and after they see him take a bullet shot to the head, they know who he is. I believe that's how it worked out. So, they eventually catch and arrest Miles, and he is publicly executed by getting shot a couple hundred times because, like I said, he can compound. And he warned about this mysterious figure called Trell, who we basically know nothing about, because he died almost immediately after warning about Trell. So, in Shadows of Self, a year after the Alloy of Law, this is going to get pretty repetitive in Mistborn, skipping a year. Elendel is in an economical crisis, and there's a murderer running around again. Harmony talks to Wax through an earring that was made from the melted down spikes of old Steel Inquisitors, and then shaped into earrings with a tiny bit of hemorrhagic power that allows him, via Ruin, to speak to him, and via Harmony to listen to him. And he tells him that the killer is a rogue Kandra called Palm of the Third, though they may call themselves Bleeder, among other pseudonyms. They're not able to be controlled by Harmony because they took out one of their own spikes, which makes them insane. So, eventually, they capture Palm, and that's pretty much the entire story. I apologize for how long this has been. So, the next book, and the third of the tetralogy, The Lost Metal, is going to release later this year, has a lot of unfinished story threads because it's followed up by an unreleased book. What we do know is that Kelsier is doing cognitive shadow weird stuff, and the Kandra are now creating metal mines that anybody can access based on technology discovered from meeting the Southern Scatterians, a group of humans who were placed at the South Pole by the Lord Ruler as a control group and untouched group of humans if he needs any. They are also doing it from researching the Bands of Morn, which the gang picked up and gave to them as a neutral force, so that Southern Scatterians wouldn't feel threatened and they wouldn't be threatening them. So Southern Scadrians are extremely technologically advanced because they were not oppressed by the Lord Ruler, and he is basically now the survivor of Kelsier before the survivor. He took extreme measures in extreme situations. In this case, he trapped Ruin in the Well of Ascension, but he also oppressed people for thousands of years, whereas Kelsier would kill anybody with noble descent or people that were helping nobles on sight if they wouldn't help him. And unfortunately, there's a lot that we don't know because it isn't finished. Next, Mistborn's Secret History. This is one of two short stories. Unfortunately, I haven't read the other, and it follows Kelsier's cognitive shadow after he dies, during the first three Mistborn books, showing important moments through the series through the eyes of a dead person who can only kind of interact with the world. He can kind of interact with the world because of him being buddy-buddy with preservation. And yeah. So, moving on to the next series, we have Warbreaker, a nice one-off that unfortunately doesn't have a sequel yet, though it will have a sequel called Nightblood. It's a political story that, unfortunately, because of time constraints, I can't tell you much about the plot, but it sets up a lot of things for the Stormlight Archive. Vasher is a major character who comes back as a minor character called Azahel repetitively throughout the Stormlight Archive. Vivenna, the person that Vasher took in, comes back as Azur, the captain of the Wall Guard, and Oathbringer, and Nightblood comes back as Zeph the Sword. It also sets up for how Hoid, a world topper with mysterious motivations, is able to retain his memories despite being alive for many eons. In reality, this is unfortunately just a Stormlight-adjacent backstory book. It also created one of my favorite quotes. "Hello, would you like to destroy some evil today?" This is by Nightblood, whose singular purpose in Sapiens, I guess, it's not really life, is to destroy evil. That is the awakened command that he was awakened with. So, we move on to The Way of Kings, which produced the only other truly iconic opening quote. Zaston, son of Valena, truthless as snow, were white on the day he was to kill a king. So, in the first book of the Stormlight Archive, we meet almost all the characters that are later staples in the series, such as Kaladin, Dalinar, Shalon, and the Honorspren. They live in a world that has rejected magic and uses fabrial technology to power things. Additionally, there are storms called high storms, which pass through every 10 days or so. Kaladin is a slave who killed a shard bearer and then got branded so that his superiors could have the shard. The book comes to a climax with a sickly Kaladin jumping over a chasm and freeing the remains of Dalinar's army that was stranded on a plateau, as another High Prince Sadias, took the bridges they used to get across, and they were all being slaughtered and surrounded until he and his bridge crew came and saved them. Next is Word of Radiance, who also has a rather good quote. "Honor is dead, but I'll see what I can do." This is a quote that is in a super climactic moment, also referencing something that we only kind of know about, because, again, until very recently we didn't understand much about shards, that honor is dead or splintered, similar to devotion and dominion. So, the story follows Kaladin as he struggles with being a Knight Radiant and therefore Light Eyes, even though he hates them. Shallan, the other major viewpoint character from Book 1, who in my mind could have just been cut and introduced in Words of Radiance, their backstory book, because they literally don't matter until now. Eventually, Kaladin and Shallan meet. Shallan steals Kaladin's boots, and they all get thrown into a chasm after a bridge breaks. They save themselves using their surges to keep themselves alive after the fall, and they get themselves out after killing a chasm feed. Have I mentioned that Brandon Sanderson suffers from giving all his major characters the super rare power syndrome? This book also generates one of the better-known fantasy quotes, A Last-Ditch Effort, where Kaladin references that their shard honor has been splintered by the evil shard Odium. The most evil, at least. Next is a short story called Edge Dancer. It produced a rather funny quote called, well, it goes, "As long as you keep trying." She stuck her tongue out at him. A totally rational and reasonable way to fight a demigod. So, this is short. story that focuses on Lift, an edge dancer who was a kid that got blessed with edge dancing, one of the radiant powers, after making friends with Wendell, a cultivation spread. So, Nail, the Herald of Skybreakers, is also a focus of this book. The story is mainly about Nail's slow acceptance to realize that he has failed and the desolation has at last returned. Talm, I believe they called him the Remain, or something like that, having finally broken and returned to the world from Braze, or as they like to call it, Damnation. The name means that it's not very happy. So, Oathbringer is the third book in the series. The book mainly focuses on Dalinar, but the drafts, until the final draft, mostly focus on Szeth, leaving some of his backstory along with many of his chapters here. It's about Dalinar slowly remembering things that have been cut off or pruned by the third and final shard of this system called Cultivation, and slowly preparing himself for a final showdown with Odium in a battle of the champions that still hasn't happened, without realizing that he was intended to be Odium's champion. It starts getting very similar to the light versus dark thing in the Wheel of Time at this point, if you've ever read that. There's a whole thing about a new storm, the Everstorm, that reincarnates Odium's elite soldiers, called Returned or Fused, depending on who you ask and where they live. Next is a short story that I've only read once, unfortunately, called Dawnshard. But, they're a lefty, called Grinfolk, so it's basically their Porne culture heritage. I can't talk about this book very much because I haven't read it more than once a while ago, but Risen, a minor character from the first 3 books, obtains one of the Dawn Shards, which is pretty much proto-shards, and was what Adonalsium, which is what all of the shards would turn into if they fused again, had as the major driving forces before the shards themselves. So, finally, Rhythm of War. The book begins a year after Oathbringer, and is now about how the remains of humans are trying to fight against Regals and Parshendi, and how a few Parshendi, such as Ryan and Venli, survived and are now trying to create a new Parshendi identity and culture away from the fighting. In the end, some of the fused and Regals ally with the humans after Fused, who was kind of insane, sent their troops on the humans when the others would not agree with a massacre of civilians. Unfortunately, many story threads are unfinished because this is the last book in the series right now. 4 out of 10 have been published. Second to last is White Sand. This is a graphic novel that, like Warbreaker, mainly sets up things for the rest of the Cosmere. However, unlike Warbreaker, which focuses on setting things up for the Stormlight Archive, it primarily focuses on behind-the-scenes stuff, such as introducing Chris, a world hopper who writes the essays at the end of the books, and how the magic system works, and presumably will play a much more important role later on in the Cosmere. It also contains the first reference to Trell, at least likely it does. The story was turned into a graphic novel from an unpublished old story, who may or may not be the Shard Autonomy. Lastly, one of my favorite books in the series, Sixth of the Dusk, also has one of my favorite quotes. "You could not stop the times from changing," his mother said, "no more than you could stop the surf from rolling." Dusk, a hunter, meets the more technologically advanced mainlanders, who the hunters don't like. We learn about the ones above, who I believe are just Mistborn Era 3 humans. We eventually discover how birds get incredible power, and techies learn about it. That's pretty much the entire story, and it focuses on colonialism, pretty much. Also, by Mistborn Era 3, I mean the originally planned Mistborn Era 3. Wax and Wane series is kind of weird. It's in between Mistborn Era 1 and Era 2, but he started calling it Era 2 and Era 2, Era 3, etc., etc. But thank you for listening to this. I'm sorry for so many grammatical errors and stuttering and correcting myself, and I'm sorry that this is so long. I did tell you that I tried to keep this under an hour and a half. Thank you for staying around.